true that he left this morning, it was an unusually brief visit for him to make to Moscow, which indicates perhaps that he wasn't getting all the meetings that he had expected to get. Now, why that is remains unclear. The reporting from the Times indicates that Yuri Ushakov had said that he was not the official envoy of Trump, which may indicate that they don't think he's senior enough, and that actually what Putin wants is a one-on-one with Trump.
It's Times Radio, it's 9:41. Now, breaking news from the Times this morning. The Kremlin is said to have dismissed Steve Witkoff, the US envoy, stating he is not a designated negotiator. Witkoff's jet left Moscow in the early hours of this morning. Yesterday, the US toughened its sanctions on Russia, imposing fresh restrictions on oil, on gas and banks by blocking them from using American payment systems. Let's get some analysis on both of these points with Stephanie Baker, who's a writer at Bloomberg and author of Punishing Putin Inside the Global Economic War to Bring Down Russia. Morning to you, Stephanie.
Morning.
What do you make of this decision by the Kremlin to dismiss Steve Witkoff? Because it was only last night that Kremlin officials were briefing out to journalists that the meeting was going to go ahead.
Right. So we have not independently confirmed that report, just to be clear. And I just checked some of the Russian newspaper sites, and I'm not seeing it reported there either. However, if it's true that he left this morning, it was an unusually brief visit for him to make to Moscow, which indicates perhaps that he wasn't getting all the meetings that he had expected to get. Now, why that is remains unclear. The reporting from the Times indicates that Yuri Ushakov had said that he was not the official envoy of Trump, which may indicate that they don't think he's senior enough, and that actually what Putin wants is a one-on-one with Trump, either a call and obviously eventually a meeting.
Talk to us about sanctions, if you would, because on the one hand, you've got Donald Trump, who critics would say he seems to be very much sort of abiding by the Putin line, saying what Putin wants. And yet on the other, we hear last night fresh sanctions were imposed on Russia. What do you make of that?
Right. So this is a bit technical, but to make it simple, when Biden imposed sanctions on Russian oil in January, there was a provision that allowed Russian banks to continue to use to continue to accept payments for Russian energy. What happened was the Trump administration let that license lapse. And so that will make it very difficult for an array of Russian banks that have been exempted for energy payments to accept money, hard currency, for energy payments. So that could have a significant impact on Russia's ability to earn hard currency, which is crucial. Now, the weird thing about this is that the Trump administration didn't announce it. They just let it lapse, which indicates to me perhaps they didn't want to make a big deal of it, or it lapsed by mistake, which is a very odd way to use a sanctions policy. When you're using sanctions, they're usually meant to indicate a diplomatic message to your opponent that you don't like their behavior, and therefore you are imposing these sanctions to extract a sort of change in their behavior. By just doing this quietly, that negates that economic tool's power, really. So there are some questions around why Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent allowed this license for Russian banks to continue to accept payment for Russian energy to lapse. Was this part of some grand strategy? Was Trump trying to quietly put pressure on Putin, saying, look, we've got this, we can do this, you better come to the table? It's unclear to me exactly.
And generally, do sanctions work as a tool against Russia? We spoke to a guest earlier on who said there have been 10,000 plus sanctions and they've not really had an effect. We spoke to a former UK ambassador to Moscow and said, no, they have really had an effect. So it does feel like there's a difference of opinion.
Well, Putin wants sanctions to be lifted on Russia. It's one of his key conditions for signing up to any deal with Trump on stopping the war in Ukraine. That indicates to me they are having a real effect. They wouldn't be a central demand of Putin's negotiating team if the sanctions weren't imposing real costs on the Russian economy. And indeed, the sanctions have cost Russia hundreds of billions of dollars. Now, they haven't been as comprehensive as they may have looked on the surface. Sure, the sheer number of sanctions is, in excess of 20,000, but there have been all sorts of exceptions made. In particular, this exception to, allowing Russian banks to accept payment for energy, because the Biden administration previously did not want to hamper Russian energy supplies in a way that would cause prices to spike. So there is further that they can go to be more effective, there's no doubt. And, Trump has threatened that he could ramp up sanctions on Russia if Putin rejects any deal. And indeed, there is a pathway for doing that by tightening the sanctions on Russian oil in particular, and perhaps putting full blocking sanctions on some of Russia's biggest oil producers, which has not happened so far because of concerns about the market fallout. Whether or not Trump has the appetite to do that remains unclear. Trump doesn't seem to be worried about price spikes. We've seen him impose tariffs widely in a way that is likely to cause higher costs for consumer goods in the United States. So maybe he has more of an appetite for incurring the costs of tighter sanctions on Russia than the Biden administration did.
Stephanie, thank you for giving us that assessment. That is Stephanie Baker. She's a writer at Bloomberg and she's author of Punishing Putin Inside the Global Economic War to Bring Down Russia.
At this moment, we have people talking in Russia. We have representatives over there, Steve Witkoff and others. And they're in very serious discussions. As you know, Ukraine has agreed, subject to this, what's happening today, to a complete ceasefire, and we hope Russia will do the same. The billions of dollars is being spent and really wasted so unnecessarily. It should have never happened. We know where we are with Ukraine, and we are getting good signals outside of Russia as to where we are with Russia. And hopefully they'll do the right thing. It's really humanity. We're talking about humanity. We're not talking about the money. But then you add the money to it, and hundreds of billions of dollars is being spent and really wasted so unnecessarily. It should have never happened. He was a great prime minister of the Netherlands. He did a great job, and that's what he's doing right now. So thank you. Well, we'd like to see a ceasefire from Russia, and we have not been working in the dark. We've been discussing with Ukraine land and pieces of land that would be kept and lost and all of the other elements of a final agreement. There's a power plant involved, a very big power plant involved. Who's going to get the power plant and who's going to get this and that? And so, it's not an easy process. The governor, and we have Chris, Chris. Supposed to be the most talented man in the world of energy, according. No, he put out a very promising statement, but it wasn't complete. And yeah, I'd love to meet with him or talk to him. But we have to get it over with fast. Every day people are being killed. It's not like, as we sit here, 2 people will be killed. Think of it. We don't need anything that they get. We do it because we want to be helpful, but.
Mr. President, some of our allies have said that they're worried that they could be the next to be attacked by Russia. You've spoken directly with the Russian president.
Yeah.
Do you think those fears are justified?
No, I don't. I think when this gets done, it's done. They're going to all want to go home and rest.